Throughout its history, Minecraft's identity has changed drastically, deviating from the expectations placed on typical games. Back in Alpha, the survival elements were more prevalent, before the addition of beds, sprinting, stackable food, and more forgiving mob behavior. Nowadays, the gameplay is much more geared towards enhancing its potential as a sandbox, making it as much a tool of creation as it is a game. This can make it harder to critique features if the underlying philosophy isn't understood. So, what is Minecraft trying to achieve, and how could it do that better? My name is Cameron, this is Minecraft Ideas Academy, and let's examine. In a previous video, I made the case that recreating the survival experience present in Alpha would be detrimental to the player base, that unavoidable challenges, destructive mobs, and limited heals would negatively affect people who like to build in survival mode. Peaceful mode isn't a solution for them either. The problem isn't all danger, but the dangers that threaten their creations. Plus, some resources such as blaze rods can't be obtained in peaceful mode. Because of this, some suggest a separate mode to be added which could have unavoidable dangers, but that would require developers to design content for two different modes, making updates take longer to come out. Would this recapture the magic that these old school players found during their first playthrough? Or is most of that the result of the game being new to them at the time, and nostalgia colouring their memories? I would say it is the latter, and as such, bringing back old mechanics wouldn't achieve this goal. We've had over a decade to get used to the typical enemy layout of spiders, creepers, zombies, and skeletons. Instead, new challenges like the Warden, a threat no matter how good your weapons and armor are, aim to fill this void. As Whitelight has said on his Minecraft videos, the larger idea that seems to encapsulate these players' interests is the focus on extrinsic motivation. Most games are like this. They give players problems to solve and goals to achieve, often coming in the form of a progression system. Minecraft has one, but it's short and flexible. There are only a few tool tiers, wood and stone being replaced almost immediately, and gold having a limited use case. And there are plenty of ways to skip parts, such as casting a nether portal instead of mining it. As a result, the player may enter the nether with weak equipment, but if they want a challenge, then that's great for them, especially if they're a returning player. These sequence breaks keep the game fresh and make it feel more open and non-linear. Many progression systems exist to drive a story forward, or add complexity as the player improves at the game. Minecraft being a sandbox game applies progression in a different way. It controls the rate at which players discover new block sets, abilities, and tools. It started off as a linear tech tree, but every update adds new items with different use cases. The progression isn't tied to the items. What matters are the things those items allow you to do, which is often multiple, depending on the playstyle and the current activity. For instance, a magma block can serve as a source of air underwater in the early game, and a way to kill mobs in a farm later on. Minecraft leans much more on the concept of emergence than progression. Instead of giving the player pre-designed challenges to work through one after the other, the challenges naturally emerge from interactions between the player's choices, abilities, the terrain, and mob behavior. This allows for a lot more possible experiences and much more opportunity to experiment than focusing on extending progression to artificially lengthen the game. Minecraft can have somewhat pre-designed challenges, like Bastion remnants and ancient cities, as long as these don't condition the player into thinking those are Minecraft's main attraction. After beating the Ender Dragon and perhaps exploring the Outer End, players are required to set their own path and create their own gameplay. This is a jarring transition, and different player types handle it in different ways. Some, like the folks at Hermitcraft, go to the end as soon as possible to obtain elytra and shulker boxes. After all, flight and mass storage are very important for large-scale builds on massive worlds. Others, like myself, deem the game finished once they complete the deliberately designed content and lack intrinsic motivation, the drive to shape one's own experience independent of goals the game imposes on them. Many players have a combination of extrinsic and intrinsic, in different proportions based on their playstyle. Intrinsic motivation perfectly lends itself to a game where almost every block can be broken and moved somewhere else. Some people can play Minecraft for years and never get bored because they treat the game like a canvas and express themselves through the things they build. Hence, it's not surprising that Mojang is leaning more into this philosophy. Game director Agnes Larson frequently emphasizes the need for new features to inspire the player to explore their creativity, determine goals, and tell stories. So far, these have mainly taken the form of new blocks to experiment with, environments to build in, and mobs to interact with. Players that lean more extrinsically motivated, preferring to be directed by the game, find it harder to see the value in such additions unless they also perform a useful function. Unfortunately, this means that intrinsically motivated players are easier to cater to because all they need is a prompt. but all of Minecraft's extrinsic goals can be exhausted faster than developers can possibly add them, even if Mojang dropped everything, hired hundreds of the most talented designers and developers, and solely focused on extending progression and providing experiences with explicit objectives. I think the key to resolving this gap between the intrinsic and extrinsic players is by smoothing over this abrupt leap from overt goals to self-motivation. There are a number of ways to do this, and Minecraft already does it to a certain extent. As you progress through the game, you gain access to new blocks and equipment. The problem is that it's much more efficient to unlock all of them before embarking on a personal project, since items like Elytra, shulker boxes, and high-tier enchanted tools speed things up considerably. Obviously, this wasn't a problem when progression was shorter, when there was no enchanting and no end cities. It's too late to remove them now, so first we need to introduce opportunities for the player to build. And for an extrinsic player, they'll need an incentive. The tricky part is designing that incentive. It needs to be worth the effort, but over time the player will need to be weaned off it, instead gaining satisfaction from the activity itself, and learning how to forge their own way forward. We can take advantage of Minecraft's emphasis on interconnectedness, systems that affect each other, leading to a wide range of outcomes. Letting a player's builds have an effect on the world can give them a tangible advantage, but it can also show the player the mark they are leaving. Alpha achieved this with its unavoidable night and tough mobs making a base necessary, but there are ways to do this without forcing the player. That would be counterproductive to our aims, and disturb players that already have intrinsic motivation. Raids are a more modern example. Since villages generate with little to no protection, the player must fortify the area to increase the chances of surviving the raid and reaping its rewards. The important distinction is that a raid has to be triggered by a player, but the outcome is the same. The player has built something and witnessed its effect on the game. Also worth mentioning are the blocks that require building to activate and enhance. Beacons sit atop a pyramid of precious blocks, conduits need a cage of prismarine, and enchanting tables can be powered up by bookshelves. While the building is simpler and the reward more specific, it still provides some mini structures to break up the typical single block workstations. Immovable structures are another method, though it's a little harder to see. End portals, spawners, and amethyst geodes encourage the player to set up convenient transportation in order to collect resources. They have found something of interest, planned an efficient route to it, and built a path that will reward them every time they use it. This perfectly clashes with the problem mentioned before. The Elytra used to just be for gliding, but players discovered a bug letting them indefinitely propel themselves, leading to firework boosting being added in 1.11.1. This resulted in Elytra being almost always superior to other forms of transport, discouraging building tunnels or paths for minecarts or horses. Mojang has attempted to resolve this in the past, namely in the Caves and Cliffs experimental snapshots. The Elytra were changed to only take damage when a firework is used, imploring players to conserve their rocket usage, thereby hopefully incentivizing gliding over boosting. These changes were not brought over to the regular snapshots or final release, however. I think all the transport systems need to be rebalanced to have niches. Mounts can be for convenient transport, minecarts for a speedy and automated journey, and Elytra for exploring entirely new areas. Or perhaps the solution lies in introducing a new mode of transport, serving as a quick way to get around, like a grappling hook with Spider-Man-like physics. That way, acquiring an Elytra could become less urgent, and players might feel less pressured to rush to the end. Ultimately, we won't know what works until people can playtest these potential changes. Let's look for some other intuitive ways to encourage functional building. Throughout my videos, I've mentioned the idea of having the environment affect mob behavior, like how soulfire and warped fungi repel piglins and hoglins respectively. Adding on to this, we could give new or existing mobs some new abilities, such as block burrowing, climbing, and jumping over gaps. Giving each mob type a different combination of competencies in these skills could encourage varied base building, out of different materials with trenches and walls, to keep every kind of mob out. Adding more defensive golems and structures, like turrets, could also make things more interesting. The spin-off game Minecraft Legends is leaning heavily into that gameplay. But remember, we don't want to disrupt people who already build. It would be unfair if an update turned their aesthetic builds into indefensible ruins, absolutely crawling with monsters. So, any mobs that have the potential to grief builds should either be summoned by players, like the Wither, delegated to specific areas, like the Ender Dragon, or at the very least be easily avoidable, like creepers and endermen only spawning in darkness, with the former only destroying blocks when the player is near. Some could even be made exclusive to nighttime, instead of just darkness, to give players the choice of whether to avoid them in sleep or fight them for their drops. We could revise the spawning of existing mobs too. The Nether update showed us how much gameplay you can add by moving mobs around. A player looking for Endermen can go to a warped forest instead of waiting for them to spawn in any old place. The frequency of ghasts and skeletons in Soul Sand Valleys make for a dramatic expedition, and the potentially intimidating hoglins can easily be avoided, since they only spawn in Crimson Forests. Let's apply this to the overworld. Currently, most monsters spawn everywhere, leading to a lack of variation in combat. You almost always have to worry about skeletons that shoot, creepers that explode, spiders that hit you, and zombies that also hit you. Some biomes have variants, like the Husk and Stray, but their mechanical differences aren't significant enough to change the approach. But if the Husk could, for example, burrow through sand, the player wouldn't need to make their non-desert bases impervious to it. And if Husks drop something of interest, players might end up specifically building a base there to farm its drops. There would likely need to be plenty of new mobs like these to ensure variety, but these could be variants with new abilities to keep them mechanically fresh. To allow builders to experiment more with darkness without having to resort to slabs, we could prevent mobs from spawning on artificial blocks. This would give the sense that the player is taming the environment, whether with dirt paths, cobblestone, brick, or wood. To make the experience a bit more polished, mobs could have spawning animations. For example, zombies could rise from the ground, spiders could drop down from leaves, and creepers could grow from a spore. Let's not leave the passive mobs out of this though. Like Stories of Old made a lovely video about having the environment react to the player, not only encouraging them to consider their actions ethically, but also allowing for more creativity in farm design. If an animal needs grass, food, a watering hole, exercise, and shelter to drop more meat or produce milk and eggs, players can provide that in any number of ways, instead of jamming them all in a cage just below the entity cramming limit. It's probably worth applying this to villagers too, given how poorly they're treated. Again, relying on the interconnectedness, in this case between different professions, could result in more complex and creative villager setups. For example, villagers could enchant the same way as players, using an enchantment table with bookshelves to gain the best enchantments, as well as needing to gossip with clerics and smiths to offer enchanted trades. Instead of placing and breaking a lectern repeatedly until you get mending, you'd instead need to figure out a setup that gets you what you want. These are a lot of small changes, but they could have a massive impact on the game, especially when combined, which means they need to be designed very carefully to ensure they're providing value for as many playstyles as possible and not ostracizing others. A lot of playtesting would need to be done at all stages of progression by a large range of players. It wouldn't be quick or easy to pull these ideas off. Additionally, how do we know that systems like these will encourage creativity? Take raids for instance. A player could fortify and develop a village, but with a good enough understanding, technical players can construct a raid farm to kill all the pillagers and obtain their loot without any further effort. These farms take a lot of creativity to initially design, and this task is extremely rewarding in and of itself. In fact, farms are likely the most prevalent functional builds, and are entirely the product of unintended emergent gameplay. They're extremely useful to serious players. The problem is that spawning mechanics and redstone circuitry are initially very difficult to understand and conceptualize, leading to many players simply copying designs from prominent creators. The desire to optimize is often greater than the desire to figure out your own solution, which is all too easy when you're playing with a fixed goal in mind. This is also seen in other sandbox games like Terraria, which has a much longer progression focused more on extrinsic motivation. Players need to construct houses to hold their NPCs, but it's easiest to do the bare minimum to qualify a structure as a valid room. This led to players building a single apartment complex housing all their villagers before the Journey's End update, which introduced the happiness mechanic. Some NPCs would be happier living in different biomes with different people. If they were happy enough, they could sell a pylon, allowing teleportation to other pylons. But again, people figured out the optimum combinations, turning the bare minimum from one giant box to multiple boxes spread across the world. So what if our ideas just result in slightly more complex farms, bases, and transport systems, where there is no need to experiment because the solution has already been worked out? What if players just make slightly less cramped farms, ugly yet effective forts, and soulless roads and tracks? This may only be a problem for players active in the community, but this focus on external goals also shows up in Minecraft itself. In my experience with survival multiplayer, once the Ender Dragon is defeated, members lose interest and the server dies, even if we are having a great time before just building for the sake of it. But perhaps it isn't rolling the credits or getting full netherite armor that causes this, but mechanics in the mid-game that actively push the player towards these extrinsic goals. It doesn't matter how many incentives for functional building we add if the philosophy of the mid-game actively resists it. I am, of course, talking about the systems of brewing, enchanting, and repairing. In my video titled What's Next for Minecraft, I briefly covered some of the problems with these, but I can go much more in depth now. Brewing is the least guilty, partially because it's easily ignorable. Most of the potions grant effects too minor to have a clear use case, except for ones like fire resistance, water breathing, and slow falling. Many of the other effects could be instead given to different foods to distinguish them mechanically, with potions serving as more targeted buffs. Since there's no recipe book for the brewing stand, and the steps are needlessly complicated, the wiki's page on brewing is one of the most popular. This could be alleviated by scrapping the corruption mechanic and giving each potion its own ingredient, so there'd be less steps to remember. Brewing is almost entirely divorced from the core building mechanics, most of it taking place in a GUI. Given that building is something we've been trying to encourage, this isn't a great start. Brewing was initially conceptualized as an in-world action through the cauldron, but this was deemed too unintuitive during development. But at least brewing can be automated through hoppers, enchanting can't, and the only build it needs is a few bookshelves. So it's even more detached from the world and the core gameplay loop of mining and building. The main thing characterizing enchanting is grind. Grind to obtain enough XP to enchant, grind to get the best enchantments. Grind isn't the same thing as repetition. The latter can be engaging and even relaxing. The problem is that enchanting is not satisfying, taking place only in the inventory, which is incredibly plain compared to the Minecraft world with its particles, sound effects, and other immersive features. It's also not challenging. There's an optimum strategy that is easy to discover and set up beforehand. Once you've done that, all you can do is enchant as much as you can, hoping you'll get what you want. Enchanting doesn't meaningfully change as you progress through the game. There's no way to influence the enchantment table later on, unless you use the Reagent Chant mod. Vanilla's system isn't like crafting or brewing. The only ingredients are XP and lapis, and both are always required. The game is much more fun when you give up attempting to get the best enchantments, but this requires actively resisting the urge to create a grindy experience farm, which is technically a functional build, but it's so important that it completely overrides the player's intrinsic motivation. Repairing requires even more XP, and by attempting to fix enchanting, it introduces its own problems, ironically enough. Done at an anvil, items can be repaired to preserve their enchantments, but an anvil can also combine enchantments, turning it into an unimmersive item dragging simulator. It's also unintuitive, with different XP costs depending on the order books are combined. Some enchantments are also mutually exclusive for balancing or technical reasons. It doesn't make sense to have Silk Touch and Fortune on the same tool, for instance. But the only way the player can find this out is by attempting to combine books with these enchantments. The GUI will not allow it, but it doesn't signpost this at all, potentially leading people to believe it's a bug. Mutex enchantments aside, there is a pretty clear meta. Each piece of equipment has an objectively best set of enchantments it can gain, and book combining makes it incredibly straightforward to get there. This results in a lack of meaningful choice, but there are ways that it could be remedied. My friend Zoe made a fabric mod for 1.18 called Indexed, where each tier has a cap on the combined level of enchantments it can receive. There's also the possibility to find overcharged equipment, or create it in an anvil. It solves a great number of problems I've identified with enchanting and repairing, so I'd recommend checking it out. Anyway, back to talking about vanilla. Repairs can only be performed a certain amount of times. The XP cost increases with every attempt. Eventually, the anvil GUI will deem a repair too expensive, no matter how much XP the player has accumulated. This was intended to encourage players to make new equipment every so often, but in 1.9 the Mending enchantment was added, which uses XP orbs to repair instead. Mending is a treasure enchantment, meaning it can't be obtained through the enchanting table, but players have found ways to reliably obtain it through villager trading halls and previously AFK fish farms, both incredibly grindy contraptions. In practice, the anvil is used mostly to hammer magical books together. Maybe this feature should be given to the enchantment table, with the anvil serving only to repair and rename items. And something would need to be done about mending to stop it from making anvil repairing totally obsolete. All of these systems contribute to a mid-game where the player is drawn away from the world, tempted with powerful items, and led into unengaging gameplay. It's no wonder so many players forget about the joy of building. What use is enchanted equipment when you have nothing to use it for? Except for killing the Ender Dragon, and after that the players are immediately expected to start setting their own goals after becoming far too reliant on the grindy systems that promise to make building and exploring easier. The last thing they see before closing the game is a barren dimension with not much to offer but the loot, the last and most poetic representation of the end of extrinsic motivation. If Minecraft wants to regain these players and keep them engaged with the world, these systems need to be fundamentally restructured so as not to ensnare players in a Kafkaesque machine. Well, that was dramatic, wasn't it? Let's pivot entirely and talk about food. Alpha's unskippable night and punishing monsters may be unsuitable for modern Minecraft, but its hunger system, or lack thereof, was much easier to understand than what we have currently. Food instantly healed the player, and while most were unstackable, this could be mitigated. Wheat, which was stackable, could be crafted using a table into bread as it was needed. Cookies stacked to 8, but were non-renewable since cocoa beans could not be grown, and only spawned in dungeons. The limited types of food at the time had their own benefits and drawbacks, and while making something inconvenient isn't the best way to nerf it, the food system was balanced. Beta 1.8's hunger system largely erased the differences between these foods, leading to only a few types being used. All food became stackable and healed hunger instead of health. Hunger's exhausted by activities like sprinting, mining, combat, and healing, so it's a much more complex system for players to understand. It required players to eat constantly, instead of using food as a simple healing item. Saturation was introduced to add some strategy to food choice, as well as being an invisible buffer for hunger drain, but it complicated the system further, especially when it was also used to determine quick heal in 1.11. And since food is so easily obtained and farmed nowadays, it's less worth the effort to switch between foods. Lastly, the thresholds for when a player stops healing, and can no longer sprint, are not communicated visually. The new system suits modern gameplay in some ways. For example, the abundance of food makes it much easier to explore far and wide. And the combat snapshots have rolled back the quick heal and tweaked the thresholds, which are welcome changes. But on the whole, I believe the food system is still too complex to achieve what it needs to. I realized this when developing my mindful eating mod. The exhaustion reduction wasn't easily noticeable, and when trying to communicate its mechanics through the icon and sheen, it ended up confusing and distracting people. Sometimes a system needs to be torn down before it can be rebuilt. Let's do that, starting with an idea that Vectorwing, creator of the Farmer's Delight mod, has been brainstorming. You have a health meter and a food meter. The food meter only goes down to regenerate health, no other reason. Eating food will heal you and also add to the food meter. You can even eat at full health to stockpile your food meter, but that way you won't be taking full advantage of it. More complex foods would overheal you a la the absorption effect, and would stack to 16. If you get attacked while eating or drinking, the animation is interrupted. This goes for other mobs too, like witches drinking potions. Now we can salvage some mechanics from mindful eating. Different food groups can serve different purposes, but instead of reducing exhaustion from an activity, as that no longer exists, they'll provide in effect cannibalized from the brewing system we are going to make more targeted. For example, instead of vegetables allowing you to run for longer, they'll be the new way to get the speed effect. Meats can give strength, carbs can give haste, sugars can give resistance, and fruits can perhaps increase a player's reach. And we can keep the rebalanced eat time, saturation, and stack size values, albeit with some extra tweaks. This will definitely also require months of iteration, playtesting, and thought for features that aren't that exciting to most of the player base. But if Minecraft is to maintain cultural relevance for 50 years like Mojang wants it to, sooner or later it will need to address these problems and update the game design of its older features. If the existing content is as enjoyable to experience as possible, that will provide a good foundation for keeping many kinds of players engaged and motivated for new flashy content like an end update or even a new dimension. From there, the end will only turn into the beginning. While Minecraft started out with much heavier survival elements, it evolved into a game focused around the player. What sort of fun does the player seek out? What sort of stories do they tell? And the mechanics of survival have revolved around that approach, by making the game more accessible to casual players and encouraging them to find their intrinsic motivation. However, systems around the mid-game funnel players into a grindfest, causing them to focus more on extrinsic motivation, only to have the rug pulled out from under them once the Ender Dragon's dying cry fades away. By redesigning these systems with player experience in mind, and adding more opportunities for players to try their hand at building, and gain both intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, Minecraft can appeal to an even greater audience and ensure its longevity. However, Minecraft can't appeal to absolutely everyone. Different expectations can conflict, and finding a compromise is tricky. In survival mode, we won't get destructive mobs that are difficult to avoid, and we won't get a perfectly safe environment in which to build peacefully. And we certainly can't get both. They're diametrically opposed to each other. In game design, this is known as a cursed problem. In the end, a game has to narrow its scope in order to provide a cohesive experience, which is why it's worth trying out many other games to find one that suits me the best. Or maybe even create a new one. It's quite telling that this video took me so long to make. I first started over 2 years ago, intending it to be a companion to Why Minecraft Updates Take Time, addressing the inevitable comments about how Minecraft's features don't appeal to the typical gaming community. But since this is such a complex topic with a heavy element of subjectivity, it was incredibly difficult to identify the problems, design possible solutions, and present them in a way that makes sense. I hope the developers at Mojang find this video helpful, though I know they already talk about this matter quite a lot, so hopefully I bring a new perspective. Poetically, I needed both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to put this video together, the internal satisfaction I get from organizing my thoughts and expressing them, and the external help, critique, and validation from my friends and subscribers. This video went through quite a few names and layouts before I was able to coalesce everything brought up into a coherent thesis. Thank you to Diggin, Creatively Jake, Mira, Nova, BD, Cap'n, and Vectorwing. An extra special thanks to Zoe, who also co-edited this video with me. So, what do you make of this philosophy? Feel free to comment below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, or become a YouTube member like Jarl, Elithris, Salo7, StonePayman, Soko Awen, and the Dead Comedian have. Next video will be so subscribe and hit the bell if you want to catch that. Thank you for watching.